Okay, so let's restart. I really enjoyed that last little session about practical for any given. I mean, we're moving when we. And then once you start getting into those complexities of climate models, it often turns out it's not a Gaussian process. So, and that's which is what John's question was. So, how can we just use these models for sort of practical inference? So, here's what this is the general purpose way we do that, and this is what I did for the function you sort of saw before. It's an example of it. You know, people may argue against this particular general purpose way, but it's a choice of basis. It's like Ernest said, how do we choose this basis? Here's one way. And it's called various things. Some people call it the Gaussian covariance, but some people don't like that because it's not a Gaussian because it's not normalized. It looks like a Gaussian though. This whole problem of looking at a Gaussian. And that caused, well, some people call it the radial basis function, and some people don't like that because the radial basis functions can take various forms. Some other people called it the squared exponential, and some people don't like that because it's not a squared exponential. A squared exponential would not look like that. So I decided to rename it the exponentiated quadratic covariance, because that's what it is. It's an exponentiated quadratic. And that's how I'm trying to refer to these functional forms throughout the thing to distinguish them from Gaussians. So what it says is if the two inputs we're interested in, so this is our input now, x could be, as we've said before, the vegetation index in a particular region, could be the amount of rainfall in the last 2 months, it could be the altitude, it could be the temperature, it could be also the time of year. Y might be malaria incidence or pneumonia incidence or something like that. We measure the distance between two x's, the two data points. Yeah? We take that distance and we square it and we divide it by a scale. So we would scale down that distance. In fact, we could make this scale affect each distance, each dimension of that distance independent if we wanted to. That's called ARD. People do that. And then that gives us this covariance. So the points I had before, because they were one index apart, plotted one index apart, the distance between every of the two neighboring points was always 1. That's why you see this banded structure. And the distance was going up in units, and the squared distance, that distance was being squared, negative exponential, multiplied by a scale. The scale gives us what the diagonal will be. This will clearly be, if the distance is 0, this will be 1. The diagonal will be 1s. If we multiply it by alpha, the diagonal will be alpha. Now, because marginally, that's going to be the variance of our function. If you think about it, if this was just marginal, if we look down on each point, this is the variance of the point within themselves. Alpha gives us, for something like this, which is a stationary function, the overall scale of our function. Yeah? So the square root of alpha is the standard deviation marginally. So when I say marginally, I mean that if before we plot the function, we can try and visualize what the function is going to look like by drawing the prior mean, which would be 0 if we have a 0 mean, and then the prior standard deviation. Oh, brilliant. Thank you, Martin. Here's the prior standard deviation. And that would be square root of alpha. Well, if it's 2 standard deviations, we often plot these things at 2 standard deviations because 95% of the points should fall within 2 standard deviations. So we often we could illustrate the prior by 0 mean, and the marginal variance, which is given by here, at each point along this line is given by square root of alpha. Yeah? In each case. So that parameter means something. This parameter means it affects how quickly the function wiggles. So if we want something that wiggles very quickly, or something that moves very slowly, it's just a scaling on the overall function, yeah? So there's these two parameters which are just saying these two things about this infinitely differentiable function. So you can see some different samples from this function. They look like this. We had one sample before. How am I making these samples? Well, the marginalization property of Gaussian processes is what allows us to go from finite to infinite. So I've just plotted 200 points along this axis, just like we did when we were plotting the polynomial fits for the marathon data. I've just taken 200 points from -1 to 1, or 100 points or something like that, and I've sampled from the Gaussian using the covariance I calculated. Now, what the marginal property of Gaussians says is that if I use that covariance to generate 20,000 points along this line, I would still see functions that look like this. What's really going on is that distance, if I take any 2 points as I've got down here, I'm linearly drawing a line between them, yeah? But it would be such, because of the length scale, as I get down to that sort of scale, that the function is approximately linear in that regime. So I can't plot. These are infinite dimensional objects. I can't plot the infinite dimensional thing, but if I plot at a fine enough scale, I get an impression of what the function looks like. Yeah, because as I go down closer and closer and closer to scales, the actual function would interpolate. Because of this length scale, it would just linearly interpolate each point at a fine enough scale. So the way I'm plotting these is just taking a discrete number of points, say 100, computing this matrix for those 100 points. So to give you a sense of how we compute that matrix, here's an example where we've got 3 input points, -3, 1.2, and 1.4, and we have a particular length scale too. And alpha I've just set to 1. So if we want to compute this matrix, we first take x1 and x1, feed it into our covariance. x1 is -3, so we get -3 minus -3, divided by 2 times 2, which is L squared. Compute the negative exponential of that, and it comes out as 1 because this guy was 0. Yeah. So next I can compute that between x1 and x2, and that gives me 1.2 minus -3, so 1.2 plus 3, divided by the same thing again. Compute the negative exponential of that, it's 0.11. Of course, because these guys always appear symmetrically in any covariance function, they must do. We need symmetry across these sides. The covariance must be symmetric. We get the same thing there. We don't even need to compute it. We get at 1.2, 1.2, x1 is, we get the 1 again there. x3 is 1.4, and x1 is -3 still. We get that coming in there, so we're now 1.4, so now the distance between these is 4.4, so we're getting smaller. So the correlation goes down, and again we put that on the other side, and finally we know what this is going to be, 1 again, so the one remaining value we need to work out is the distance between x3 and x2, 1.4 minus 1.2. They're very close together, so the correlation's high. And then that's where we get our elements for the covariance function. Oh dear. That's where we get our elements for the covariance function from there. And moving forward, I've now visualized it in that color code, and you can see because the correlation is so low relatively here, it's almost saying that these 2 points, because they're close together, x 1.2 and x3 1.4, are highly correlated with each other because they're close. Under my covariance function that says give me correlation, and this third point is some distance away. It's not fully independent because, as we saw, there were some values in there, but relative to this correlation it's much more independent. So you can look at the structure of this covariance and see what's going on in your data there. So I've got some other examples here. So I've got a data point at -3, 1.2, 1.4, and a fourth data point at 2. So I'm adding a fourth data point to that group before. So we just go through if we need an extra data point. So this might be a test data point. So we might have done that in training for these 3. Yeah? And now we've got we need to compute in that equation we saw before. So someone's given us the fourth data point, and in order to predict the locations at the test data points, we now need to compute the cross covariance and the variance of that fourth data point. So we take that fourth data point and compute its relevant terms. Now we will know that this fourth data point, those formulae before, will tell us the distribution of this fourth data point given the previous three. And we'll find it's very strongly correlated to these two because it's at position 2, and it's not correlated at all to the first one, really. Very low correlation.
So we've got 1 on the off-diagonal.
Here. That's because these things are so close that when I've gone down to 2 significant figures, the 0.996 has gone to 1.
Okay.
Sorry, thanks, John. Yeah. So in the last one, yeah, we this one here is not quite 1. Yeah, it's 0.996, but I've gone to 2 significant figures for all these. They're all at 2 significant figures. I have a special command in Octave I use to generate 2 significant figure numbers, so I just auto-generate, didn't notice. But yeah, so this is really 0.996. And so these are quite strongly correlated with these two. So if we made an observation that at x2 the function was 3, and at x3 it was 3.1, we're going to be highly confident, given this covariance, that at x4 it will be around the area of 3. Yeah, the value will be approximately 3. If we've noted at x1 that the function was -1, it doesn't affect things that much. It will affect things a little bit, but not much. Because the distance between x1 and x4 is 3. And relative to our scale of 2, that ends up being not very far. That means it ends up being quite far. So we can see that in this correlation structure we have here again. Here's another example where I've just taken the same 3 initial data points, but now I've put this length scale higher. So we're sort of increasing L. So we expect more correlation across this input space here. So it's the same actual distance, but it's being divided by a larger number. So, and I've also done, just to confuse things, I've made alpha 4. So I've made the scale of the function larger. So I'm making the length scale longer and the scale of the function larger too. When I make the scale of the function larger like that, that just gives me an overall thing. Now if I want to see the correlation, I need to divide these guys by 4. So the correlation is much higher now. The correlation is about 50%, 55%, something like that, with x1. So x1 now is having an influence. Not a stronger influence. The most influence on x4 we would get if we were to predict at x4 would be from x2 and x3. But x1 is having a stronger influence because it's basically saying these functions are varying slower. So this is a sort of instinctive understanding you get out of the covariance function. Okay. Now, here's another really cool feature of Gaussian processes. So this is going back to basis function models. This is a basis function model with just 3 bumps, like we looked at before, yeah? So we can get a function out of it, m bases, and then we've got these weights, like we had before. So this is back to the parametric Bayesian models we looked at before. Now, and of course, if the standard linear model, we would have that basis. We can look at functions derived from this model just like we did before. So we could sample W from a Gaussian with this distribution. So this is our prior for W, yeah? And now we're visualizing the functions in exactly the same way we've been visualizing the Gaussian process functions. Now what you'll see is that they're going down at the edges. Why are they going down at the edges? Anyone? These are the basis functions. And when I sample from, so we've got 3 basis functions located between -8 and 8. What's happening in this region here? 0. Why is it 0?
Are they going to 0?
They're all going to 0, yeah. Why are they going to 0 though?
Strong correlation?
Well, there is, good question about, the correlation is difficult to compute in this region. I had to think about that for a moment, yes. It is very strong, but it becomes difficult to compute. But why specifically? We've got 3 basis functions. Where are our basis functions located? Here. Give me a rough location for this basis function. Where's its center? -4. Where's the center of this one?
0.
Where's the center of this one? Yeah? What happens at 27? There's no basis functions. You build this model, you do Bayesian inference, good luck on your predictions out here. You will be highly confident the function is 0 at all times. There is no possibility for the function to be non-zero. That is the danger of parametrics. That's why you need non-parametrics. And we'll show you why now. So, we've done this before actually. So we can get the covariance for this model using the rules of multivariate Gaussians. The covariance for this model is phi transpose, where phi is our basis function set. So the nice thing now is everything I've shown you for RBFs. Oh, that's disappeared. Sorry, I now have to go forward. It's not there. Oh, damn. The nice thing would have been... got lost. There it is. I don't know how this slide ended up in the wrong place. This is the same slide for that system. So the covariance is just a function of x and x prime. It's the inner product of x. This is the vector of the value of those three bases, like you've been computing before. And the covariance just turns out to be the inner product of those two things. Now, in this region here, -4 to 4, that looks awfully familiar, doesn't it? That looks quite a lot like that RBF covariance. But as you go outside this region, everything drops to 0, because these functions are 0 in that regime. So this is a parametric model. Actually, the bases are placed at -1, 0, and 1 in this case. And in this parametric model, you will only get activity in this region. Now, that's an effect you might want. You know, it's actually it might be a fun thing to do, to combine this with another process, because you might know that in some small region, there's extra things happening. You might know that. And so you might want to include that. You might know that it's 0 outside the region. But be very careful about using this in the Bayesian framework, because you're saying something quite specific. You're saying, as you leave this region, nothing's happening. And all parametric models have these type of problems associated with them. Okay. So that's the danger of these parametric models. Now, I might have time at the end to show you a nice result, which actually, well, I'll explain the result now, because I don't think I will have time at the end. So, yeah, in fact, that slide was coming at the end of the result, I think. So the nice result that is encoded here is, this is an issue with the basis function model. You need to choose the location of centers and the number of centers. Now, it turns out that this analysis that's in the slides you can look at in your own time in 1D. If, and this extends to multi-dimensions in various ways, but let's just think of it in this way. If you decide to have equally spaced, they don't need to be equally spaced, but in this analysis they're equally spaced, basis functions across the real line, and then you start reducing the spacing between those basis functions till it's down to 0, and then you decide to spread those basis functions from -infinity to infinity. So this is all mathematical trickery for doing this. You recover this covariance. So this covariance has an interpretation as a radial basis function model, where you're spreading those basis functions across the entire real line. So everywhere you go, there is a basis function there, which means that you sustain the uncertainty where you leave the data. And it's a mathematical thing to show that, and it's shown in these briefly in these previous slides, but we're not going to have time to do that and look at lab class stuff, so it is in there. So you can imagine it though, can't you? It looks like it's starting to happen. Of course, what you need to do is start bringing these mu's closer and closer together. You also need to scale down the w's that you're weighting these things by, or else everything blows up. And then you start spreading the mu's out along the real line. And then you just recover that RBF covariance. So that's the difference between a parametric and a non-parametric model. In a non-parametric model, the basis function interpretation of a Gaussian process requires infinite basis functions to make sense. Infinite basis functions means infinite parameters w. Yeah? The model has infinite parameters. What that actually means is the model has an increasing capacity with data. Non-parametric means that as I observe more and more data, my model doesn't restrict its flexibility. It responds, it continues to respond to the data. That's what non-parametrics is. Parametric models, you select a number of parameters at the start, and the most amount of information you can have about your data is always funneled through those parameters. So let's say we have 4 parameters in our model. It doesn't matter how much we see about our data, we're always summarizing that data set by 4 parameters. Because we only need those 4 parameters to predict test points. So you give me 95 million data points, I still only have 4 parameters worth of information. In a non-parametric model, like a Gaussian process, you can't summarize it with a fixed number of parameters. You need infinite parameters to summarize it. So you actually summarize it with the data itself, which means that your complexity of your model continues to grow as you add data. Now that does lead to some problems, which is the computational complexity of the model will also grow as you add data, and you need some tricks to deal with that. But it is a nice feature. It's something that you think, well, that makes sense to have a model that continues to respond as I give it more information. Parametric models don't, non-parametric models do. So that's a good philosophical reason for them.
If I may ask, if the model keeps on changing with the amount of data, then when do you use the model to predict? Because
you do that. Well, that's always going to be the case even for a parametric model. So, but in the real world, I mean, this is the sort of online learning scenario, and then you try and build models that incorporate the new data and continue to predict. That's what you'd like to do. And then the problems you might face is if you leave it completely unsupervised doing that, will it start just doing crazy things? So people like the idea of training a model and then sending the model out into the field and leaving it because they probably played with the trained model and they know it's behaving sensibly. If you keep training it when it's in the field, maybe you'll get problems. And that's why you sort of need Bayesian inference type techniques to deal with that, to try and tell when that's happening. But in general, you get the same situation with parametric and non-parametric, that if you do get more data, you do have to update, you might want to choose to update your model, and you have to do that in some way. So that doesn't matter. I think there are problems there for both. But it can be a problem if the model is outside the control of the modeler, because maybe the data's really weird, and so the model starts producing odd predictions. So people do look at that. I think that's an interesting challenge for machine learning, or for robot learning. Robots are sort of trying to learn all the time maps of where they are and stuff. Okay, I think I don't need to go backwards now. Okay, so clearly what we're going to do now is show an example of interpolation with this model. So here's 2 data points, and this might be work particularly Tony O'Hagan, but also at Sheffield, Jeremy Oakley do on predicting the output of a computer simulation. So this is something people do with Gaussian processes. They say, you have a climate model, and it takes a month to run. So every time you select a set of parameters, it takes a month to run your climate model, just to get the output. But they want to explore how the model would change with different parameters. So one thing they do is, they run the model for a few points, and then they use a Gaussian process to try and predict where things will be between those points. But in this case, there's sort of no noise on the points. It's a computer model, there's no noise on it, it will always say the same thing. So they want what I would call interpolation. They want functions that go right through this. So you run your computer model with parameter set to -1, the parameter of the climate model, and then it gives you an output of -2. And then you run the climate model with parameter set to 1, and it gives you an output of 1. So then you fit your Gaussian process, and this, what we're showing here, is the mean and the variance of the predictions, given the length scale we've used. Now notice, outside where there's data, the variance just blows up really quickly, and because, in effect, there are basis functions across the entire line, it sustains that variance. Like over here, the variance would still be very wide. That's what non-parametrics is getting you, this representation, the Gaussian process representation. This uncertainty is sustained. So now the idea is maybe once you've done that, you ask for another measurement and it comes there and you can add that measurement in. This would be updating the model according to new data. And there's 2 more measurements which we might be make, and they come in. And there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 more measurements, and they come in, and the whole thing, in this case, because of the parameters I've chosen, collapses down to be massively confident. Now, the effect you're seeing here of this confidence is very similar to the Nyquist sampling theorem. Signal processing is all based on band-limited signals. How many people are familiar with signal processing? Anyone? Okay, so turns out band-limited signals are just a particular type of Gaussian process, and a pretty ugly one. Because these processes also have interpretations in Fourier spaces. So these processes, you can look at the Fourier spectrum of this process with this covariance function, and it's a Gaussian spectrum in Fourier space. A band-limited signal is a square function in Fourier space. And in effect, that's what people are using as a prior when they do signal processing. And reconstruction theorems are based around the fact that if you know frequencies don't exist above a certain point, you can reconstruct your signal exactly. So they turn out to be rather odd, degenerate Gaussian processes. They collapse to 100% confidence. This one appears like it's done the same thing when we've got the sample rate down to a certain amount. Actually, there's a little bit of uncertainty, very small, between these things, but it's so small that you can't see it. And when you get into these types of domain, you can get numerical problems. And the reason it's happening is, so in Nyquist sampling theorems, you have, in Fourier space, you have, so if you don't know about Fourier space, you can ignore this bit. You have a filter that looks like this, sort of square function. It says no frequencies above this value. For the Gaussian process, you've got filters that look like this. They have quadratic tails. So they become confident that the high frequencies are unlikely to exist, but they actually have support across the entire real line. So that allows them to model any function in theory. In practice, they don't like it because they don't believe these frequencies exist. They're heavily weighting them down. Now you can go to other filters in these spaces based on the student chi distribution, which is the same distribution we were talking about for robust noise. And the same effect happens. You can get filters that do this. Have a lot of support for high frequencies. In fact, an extreme one of these has so much support for high frequencies, you get non-differentiable functions, and that's called the OU process. But you can actually vary between the differentiability of the function. You can reduce the smoothness, and you get something called the Matern family of covariance functions. And they're all based on the student T filter in this space. So the way you get these covariance functions is basically by reversing the you have to apply some math to reverse the Fourier spectrum, and you can compute the covariance. If you specify a filter in Fourier space, you can compute a covariance in time space. So the people that invented the techniques of signal processing were very aware of this interpretation, the Gaussian process interpretation, but at the time they couldn't do, this is sort of the 60s, Stratanovich, they could not do the sort of complex computations you need with all these matrix inverses to do predictions with the Gaussian processes we can use today. So they basically mentioned them, but all the theory of signal processing was based on the stuff that was feasible with the electronics at the time. But now we can revisit all those thoughts and look at those things again. And we had a nice workshop on that type of thing. There's a guy called Simo Saka that's doing a lot of work in this area in Sheffield in June. So I would say regression is the case where you have noise as well. So in the noisy case, you don't interpolate directly through your points, just like we had with the marathon case. You have variance either side. But you still have this uncertainty in regions beyond that. So examples, we've looked at the Kiprotich data, we've looked at we've talked about C14 calibration curve in the first lecture. This is just a general regression where you've got the Gaussian process plus noise. This was a case where we just had no noise in the process. Yeah. So that's the one where you can get numerical instabilities. where the noise is very low and points come close together. Now, can we determine, though, the next question might be, how do we get the basis? It's Ernest's question again. Well, how do we, even if we've got this RBF covariance form, even if I persuade you that that's a good form for your data, there's still two parameters that we need to decide on. Can we get those parameters out somehow? Well, the answer is yes. And we get those parameters. One way we can get those parameters is maximum likelihood again. But it's now maximum on that marginal likelihood term. Sometimes that's called type 2 maximum likelihood. It's called empirical Bayes. It's called evidence maximization. It's got various names. I kind of like the term type 2 maximum likelihood because it was invented during the Second World War by a guy called Jack Good, who worked with Turing on decoding German Enigma messages, and I think that's pretty good heritage. So we can use type 2 maximum likelihood. If we were starting from scratch, I would call it maximum marginal likelihood. But it's got these various names. Some people say empirical Bayes. I don't like that term at all. What we just do is we recognize that the parameters, let's call them theta, this is alpha and L, but together let's call them theta, are just existing inside this covariance matrix. So this is the marginal likelihood of the data. It's just Gaussian, jointly Gaussian with this covariance, and we just maximize the likelihood of this covariance matrix with respect to those parameters. Now, one way we can do that is by identifying what the relevant terms are. So the two relevant terms where it appears are k, the determinant term, and e to the minus y transpose inverse ky. So in log sense, when we take the log likelihood, they appear like this. Now, I think that these terms have two nice interpretations. So the error function that we've been using before, you can think of as being split in these two ways. So the log determinant term, where the data does not appear, and the data dependent term. And this is what's going on when you're maximizing the likelihood of a Gaussian process. So we've talked about how multivariate Gaussians, I'm only going to maximize the likelihood for 2 data points here. Okay, apologies for that, because I can't draw any more on the board. So this is the contour of that multivariate Gaussian, but it's also the contour of a quadratic, the quadratic form. If we look at the log contours, it's a single contour of the log form. And we talked about how multivariate Gaussians are really just rotated versions of independent Gaussians yesterday, yeah? So you've got some rotation and you've got some sort of principal directions. Now, the data fit portion of this likelihood, if we were, so this is a distribution over y, y1 and y2, two observations. So I can plot y1 against y2 in this region here. Okay, so this is oh no, that's the next bit, sorry. I can plot y1 and y2, and it might end up here, right? So that's at time 1, I get, if this is y1 on this axis, at time 1, I make an observation of something positive, if this is 0, and at time 2, I make an observation of something even more positive. Now, maximum likelihood in this data fit term involves you wanting this, because it's a negative quadratic, you want the data point to fall as low as possible in here. Yeah, you've got a few different ways of doing that. You could blow up this quadratic ball. Yeah, you could just scale this quadratic up so much that the distance between this point and here was effectively 0. We could make the quadratic ball have infinite width, and then we could get 0 there. So that's one thing we could do. We'll explain why we can't do that in a moment. Another thing we could do, if we wanted to keep the scale of this the same, we could just try and rotate this guy around a little bit. Or we could just expand one of these directions or another. We've got a few different ways we can make that point fall closer down. Now that's what's going on between 2 points. But really that's going on multiple times between all points. They're all being asked to fall further down this well. So that's the data fit term. If these points fall in these wells, the data fits better. And if you just optimize this term on its own, you can get this data fit term down to 0. No problem. So here's one way of doing it. I scale the variance of k to be infinity, so that the variance, so this inverse k is 0. Yeah? I can just scale up k to be enormous, that's what I said before, and then I can get this term to be 0. But another way of doing it is to actually match up the correlations of these so that the crosses keep appearing, you know, that if you've got a constrained volume here, that the crosses are always, you rotate these things around such that the crosses fall as much as possible in here. So that's what that term wants to do. Now, why does it not just blow up? Well, the other term is the determinant. Determinants are the products of these eigenvalues, yeah? We talked about that. They're the volume. So the volume term, if we have a three-dimensional one, it just becomes a three-dimensional term. He doesn't want it to blow up. He says, you're going to pay a penalty, which is the volume of the things you're willing to countenance. So in some sense, what goes on is this term here, if he blows up, he's willing to consider more things as being possible. Yeah? And he's allowed to do that. But he's not penalized for doing that. He's got all the resource in the world. So he just takes in whatever and decides, I'm going to pull everything together. What constrains him to not completely blow up is this determinant term that says, yeah, you pay a penalty by blowing up like that. By considering more things are possible, you pay a penalty. So that's a complexity constraint. So the determinant term, the penalty it pays is it's only got a limited amount of probability mass. This is the normalizer of the Gaussian distribution. Yeah, and it has to integrate to 1. So what's really happening here is exactly what happens with all probabilistic fits, that if we have a distribution here and then we observe a point here, it can just blow itself up to try and absorb that point, but it can't because it's constrained to have a volume of 1. So it has to actually shift itself over, and it has to lose something down here in order to do that, to keep the volume 1. And this is the term that controls that. So when you learn parameters in these models, so this is the idea of the data fit term is trying to rotate to acquire the point. So the rotated volumes don't change anything, but rotating there allows you to sort of reduce the likelihood somehow. You can't do that willy-nilly. You do that willy-nilly in principal component analysis, actually, because you've got full ability to move everything. You're constrained to how you do that because of the way the thing's parameterized. But just to give you an example of this sort of linear regression term here, what I'm showing in blue is the capacity term, and in red the data fit term. So the data fit term starts out low and goes high, but the capacity term starts out high and goes low. And since we're minimizing an error, the sum of them, so these are both sort of monotonically changing. This is monotonically decreasing, and this is monotonically increasing. So as we, the data fit gets poorer as we change the length scale, yeah? And the model becomes smoother. So data fit's going, I can't handle these points anymore. They're falling outside my well. Every time I reduce the length scale, if you think about, in this case here, what's happening is it's able to independently rotate all these little bits to capture the point, because it can capture this point here 100%. It's actually going right through the middle. And it can capture this point here and this one, this one, this one without affecting any of the other points. So that's what it does. It goes and captures all the points and it gets its minimum value. Now, because I've fixed the noise here, we're not looking at noise optimization. The minimum value isn't quite 0. That's why we've got a little bit of noise around each one. But the capacity term says you can model a lot of stuff with that. Yeah? There's a bunch of different functions you can model with that, and you're paying a penalty for using all that modeling power. But as we increase the length scale, well, now the data fit can't fit quite as well. It starts going up, because as it tries to fit that data point, there's a correlation where it has to do something to fit the other data point, and it has to find a compromise. So it goes up monotonically as we increase the length scale, because the compromise gets worse. But the capacity term is going, oh, that's much better. That's much better. It much prefers it. It keeps going down, monotonically down. Now, between them, there's a compromise. And I would say that's a pretty good compromise, yeah? It's one that you are eyeing and thinking, yeah, that's reasonable. It should be reasonable because it's the correct parameters that I actually generated the data from. So that's maximum likelihood going on in the Gaussian process, or type 2 maximum likelihood, or maximum marginal likelihood, empirical Bayes. Now there can be problems with this process. This is a real data set. I don't know why I've lost my bibtech, from a paper with my student Freddie Kalitzis, where we were looking at gene expression measurements. And actually we're trying to fit 3 parameters, but we're only showing 2. We're showing that we've optimized exactly the overall scale of the data. And on this axis we're showing a signal to noise ratio. So it's deciding how much signal, how much noise is in this data. And on this axis it's showing a length scale ratio. And actually this plot has sort of 3 interesting points. It has a point here, a point there, and I think one's way off over there. This point is way off over here. It's a potential explanation of the data that says, sorry, it's all the way down there as well. No signal, all noise. So it's hard to see, but this line here is mean 0 and the variance is 1, saying this is just noise. And it's got some likelihood. This is an alternative explanation, which is, yeah, there's some noise, but it's pretty smooth. And here's an alternative third explanation, which says there's no noise. And the function just goes through all these much more wiggly. And these 2 explanations are here and here. And they both have separate modes. So when you do the optimization, if you start near here, you end up here. If you start near here, you end up here. So it's a multimodal optimization surface, and that can happen, particularly for lowish data. We had 30,000 genes here, so we were capable of finding one where it happens. It's quite difficult to construct examples where this happens, but this is a real data example where it's happened. And these are my attempts to actually do a better job on showing that example, which have so far failed. And here's finally what we've really been after the whole time, is the Gaussian process fit to the Olympic data. Now, I think it's quite a nice fit. You're going to recreate the fit now in the lab. Anyone would like to say anything that's wrong with the fit? I think there's something wrong with it. And I think I know why that thing's wrong with it. I haven't tested this. I only ran this fit last night at 1 o'clock. I thought, I better fit the Gaussian process to the data. Hope it works. So what's perhaps wrong with this fit? I think there's something wrong with it. Anyone? What's it saying, predicting in, I'd say particularly this region here?
There may be a possibility after 2012 where the term will be constant.
Yeah, I think, but it's sustaining uncertainty over that, so I think that's okay. There's something a bit more that, that I don't like in this region. John's got it. Anyone else? Yeah, the error bars are enormous, yeah? I think any human would know that they weren't suddenly going to start running the marathon in 3.5 minutes per kilometer. Multiple reasons for that. I think first of all, there's this nasty point here, which is actually, in this case, it's 2 and it's maybe close to 3 standard deviations outside. If it collapsed the variance in this region here, this would be like 10 standard deviations outside. The model is never going to do that. That's an issue of the Gaussian noise. It hasn't allowed robust noise. So one thing that could fix this quite nicely, I think, would be a robust noise model, which is related to the barrier function. So things come nicely full circle there, but a robust noise model could help. I think something else might be happening here, just eyeing the data. I feel that there's higher variance. Loosely, I mean, it's just an instinct in this region than there is in this region here. So up until 1960, it looks to me that things fluctuate a bit more. That actually what's going on here is people found out how you run a marathon. Yeah? People stop messing up. But there's some variation in what's going on. There's some slight improvement within whatever, this is Athens. which was, I think, was hot and humid. It's the slowest one. London was, I think, hotter even than Beijing, so it's slightly slower. So these things, these fluctuations are occurring. They have to be put in the noise. But it looks to me like we learnt about how you do a marathon here. And even if you remove that point, I haven't tested this, you can try it in the lab now. I suspect the variance would be too high. And what you really need is a process where the variance is perhaps decreasing over time. And people have worked out a heteroscedastic noise. People have worked out ways of doing that as well. But yeah, overall, it's predicting that the marathon time will be about the same next Olympics as it was this Olympics. And I think it's probably right. But it's got way too high a variance. Yeah. Okay. So that was the thing I was going to do if I had time, and that's why that slide ended up in the wrong position. Oh, yeah. Here's some just as a final thing. This is the covariance function for linear regression. What we started out the whole thing on. And if you you're just in a product for x, and so it has this effect that at 0 it's 0. There's no uncertainty at 0. And then as you go out, the uncertainty goes up quadratically. It means the standard deviation is going up linearly, which if you think about it makes sense because a marginal variance like that would enable functions like this to it. Here the variance is going up quadratically because the standard deviation of these functions is going up linearly. Now there's also, you need the anti-correlation between these points. In order to get, if you want to add a bias to this whole thing, you need to add a constant term, which allows everything to shift up and down together. So just putting a constant in on your covariance allows everything to move up and down together, and that's a really useful thing to do. So you can add all these things together. You can have a linear plus exponentially quadratic plus a bias plus a noise. This is something we sometimes call the MLP covariance function. It was derived first by John Quinn's supervisor, Chris Williams. It's this sort of interesting non-stationary covariance. So it has activity in this region here, but as you move away from 0, these functions tend to saturate. So it's an example of a non-stationary. By non-stationary, we mean that stationary covariance functions are one which are dependent only on the distance between x and x prime. Yeah? So basically, you're only ever dependent on the distance. It doesn't matter where you are on the input space. In this case, it matters where you are on the input space. What the covariance changes, the distance, even though these 2 points are the same distance apart as these 2 points, the relationship between them is different. They're very strongly correlated here, they're less strongly correlated here. That's a non-stationary covariance. Is that one stationary or non-stationary? Is it dependent only on the distance between 2 points? Come on, answer. Is what? No, non-stationary. 50-50 chance. Non-stationary because this isn't dependent only on the distance. So the behavior is different here. Your variance is 0. Yeah? So in fact you see it when you look at the covariance functions that in this region here, well, the way we've plotted the covariance functions, because we've lined up the data to plot these covariance functions. In this region here, you're not got any variance at all, but here you've got higher variance. Stationary covariances must have a diagonal. It's not the only thing they must have, but they must at minimum have a diagonal which is constant. And that's going to happen because it's only dependent on the distance between 2 points, and the distance is 0 always for a point in itself, so the diagonal must be constant. You could develop covariance functions which have a constant diagonal which are non-stationary, and people have done. But at minimum they must have a constant diagonal because they're dependent only on the distance between 2 points. And this is this OU covariance function. This is the one that is non-differentiable, that has I'm not sure if it's that Cauchy distribution. Remember the one, the lighthouse that was flashing at the coast? I'm not 100% sure, but I believe that's the filter you need in Fourier space, the form of that Cauchy distribution, to get this covariance out. So it's allowing very, very high frequency things because that Cauchy distribution, remember, didn't have a mean, so it has very, very heavy tails. So it gives non-differentiable things. This is also a Gauss-Markov process. Now, what does that mean? It means that the points here exhibit the Markov property, that if you know a point just before, then you don't need to know anything that came before that to predict the points in the future. An example of a physical process that this system represents is so Brownian motion, a piece of pollen moving, getting randomly bounced around. Brownian motion, but in some sort of field that tries to keep the pollen centralized. That's what you get. So this piece of pollen is being forced towards 0. So as it goes up here, it's like going up a hill. So it ends up going around. It's like a ball in a parabolic tube trying to move, getting bumped around by random noise. That's what this process is. So very different from but no discontinuities. So there is a really excellent book, which again is by John's supervisor. Maybe he should be here with this talk. And Carl Rasmussen, two of the pioneers of Gaussian process models, that really describes a lot of this very, very clearly. The major thing they do that really I hate is they transpose the design matrix. But other than that, it's very, very good. And even better, it's available as PDF online. So it's free to go and read and look at. So a lot of the material I've covered in well, actually, we would have been about on the right time had it not been for the faffing around with the recording. But I've covered quite a lot of material in a short time and tried to throw concepts at you that give you a sense of what these Gaussian process models can do for you. We spent quite, I think you're all parametric model experts now. You've got basis functions. You should be able to fit those things. You're going to be less expert, perhaps, with these GP models. But we've got our Gaussian process toolkit, GPI, which we're going to do the lab in. So it tries to make a lot of these things well. The GPI toolkit is first and foremost for us, it's where we do all our model development. So if we have an idea, we're using it to develop our methods. But secondly, we've written it in Python so that other people can get access to it and use it. And we're trying to make easier to use interfaces. It's very powerful and therefore complex underneath, but we're trying to build easier to use interfaces to it on the top so that people can just try it on their sort of data problems. And that's what we'll do in the lab session. We'll probably have a bit of discussion in a moment for how we'll do the lab session and whether we want to wait till later in the afternoon or whatever, have lunch first or something. And we had this idea of a bring your own data type session. So maybe we should merge the lab session with that. I don't know, we'll discuss that in a moment. So the GPI toolkit gives you an ability to run quite powerful models with hopefully a few simple commands in Python. And because we're licensing it under a BSD license, you can then go and use those things in whatever application you want without giving us any money or owing us anything or whatever else. So the idea is to get Gaussian processes more widely used. Because they're very powerful models. So with that, I'll end. We'll have some questions, and then we'll discuss when to do with the lab session. So, questions. A lot of information in the last 2 hours. Yeah?
It's just the analysis of the marathon.
You want to know if you can win the next Olympic marathon.
Yeah, I mean, you said intuitively, for example, the variance at the end where the minimal is more evidence is a bit high. I mean, does this improve? Are there ways of improving this using GPI?
Yeah, I think we would need to improve the model. It's back to your old question. Where do you get that covariance from? Well, we just pluck this one out of the general covariance that seems to work well in a lot of applications. And then we assumed constant noise. And I think the weaknesses in this fit are associated with that approach to data. That approach to data is okay. It's better than just doing a linear regression on this data set. And I think in general it works okay. But I would be dissatisfied if I was the client and someone gave me this answer back. Because this is like the first thing one could do. And once you've done this fit, I think you're going to have those questions in in mind. Now, how could you do it with a Gaussian process? Well, I think first of all we should be looking at the logarithm of the data, not the data directly itself. I think that might help. This effect of approaching a value and improving in percentage-wise. If I'm ever thinking something's going on with percentages, I'm thinking percentages means multiplying, and that means I should be looking at logs because that means things are additive. So any multiplicative model, Gaussian processes don't work well with multiplicative things, but a log multiplicative thing is an additive thing. So I would immediately be thinking, yeah, let's do a bit of logging. I mean, you should, I mean, not logging as in people do in the rainforest. The harmless type of logging, where you take the logarithm of your data, and that would perhaps be the first thing we should be doing here. Even then, maybe we don't like this point, which we even have an explanation as to why it's so far out. But then maybe things can go wrong in the Olympics. Maybe we want that type of uncertainty. Maybe there could be there was an attack on the Boston Marathon, you know, that sort of thing. Maybe we want to include that type of eventuality. There's some outside possibility. But I would feel that's a non-Gaussian noise. That would be one which should have a narrower variance and then heavier tails, which is what happens as you go student T. I don't know, any other thoughts people have on the data?
Just a question, so if we were going to make the length scale a function dependent on the inputs, is there a sort of plug-and-play method of doing that?
There is, and that's this one that looks stationary but isn't. It was a covariance function by Mark Gibbs, who was a student of David Mackay's, and he has an approach that allows you to vary the length scale across the input domain. Now that's clearly not stationary, because in some regions the length scale is small and the function varies quickly, in other regions it's large. It does have an odd effect, which you might not expect. You might think, oh, this is ideal. I really want to use this. One odd effect that this covariance function has is if it's long in this region here, so we've got some input here, and at this point the length scale is very large, and then it drops down, and then it goes up again. And when I say large, I mean that this scale is the order that scale. Yeah? But this scale might be even approaching 0. So basically in this region here, the function's doing that. But overall the function is doing this. Well, what will happen is it will always exit this region at the same level where it entered it. Because there's a correlation between these 2 points. What you end up with is this odd thing that there's a correlation between these 2 points and they're independent of these points. So you can't, that's often not what people expect when but it's the right result when you think about it. There's no other way of doing this. And that's what comes out of the covariance function. You sometimes just want some sort of non-stationarity. And non-stationarities are interesting because you start getting what I think of as like a meta-parametric model. So you can add non-stationarities, and one way of doing it is to add in that MLP, well, here's a really excellent way of adding in non-stationarities. So any covariance, if you've got a Gaussian process, x, and you multiply it by a deterministic function, g, this is still a valid Gaussian process. And the covariance of this Gaussian process will be kxx prime, if that's the covariance of f of x, times g of x, and I always like to write this way around, but I could write it the other way around, times g of x prime. So it's just this covariance multiplied either side by this function. So now we can get a non-stationarity in real easy, because we could just make g of x a Gaussian, yeah? And then we could multiply it by this covariance. And then the type of functions we'll get, you think about what effect this has, this is going to be like an alpha that varies over time, yeah? A variance of the process that starts at 0, goes up to 1, and goes down to 0 again. And you could put a location parameter on it. And if you look at samples from this, they would be really cool. They would do this sort of thing, and it would give you like a chirp, a non-stationary chirp that you could put in your data. But you need one of these every time you have a non-stationarity, and you need to sort of sum them up. So you would then have like alpha 1, well, alpha I I equals 1 to k. You'd have a sum of these things. That looks awfully like a basis function model. And indeed it is. It's just a basis function model with a super complex chirrupy basis function. So you've sort of gone the whole circle around to do something very complicated and ended up with potentially the same problems you started with. How many non-stationarities are there? Where are those non-stationarities located? You could optimize this mu, and I'm sure this would work and it would be nice. I haven't done this, but I've just sort of thought through this whole process and then realized, oh, you get back to the same problem you started with, and it would be fun to see if it worked, though, I don't know. So every question leads me off on a tangent, which answers something that wasn't the question at all. Sorry. Any other questions then? Okay, so why don't we stop? We'll stop the video, and we're